What would you do if the only thing your father left behind was a threadbare coat and a debt that could swallow the sky? If the land that held your entire life, every memory of your mother's garden, and every fence post your father drove into the hard dirt, was about to be signed away on a piece of paper in a warm office miles from your home? For Margaret Vale, this wasn't a question. It was the cold, hard morning of her 25th year in the Wyoming Territory. The banker had been polite, his words smooth as worn river stones, but their meaning was sharp. Foreclosure. The word hung in the air of the small cabin long after his buggy had disappeared down the dusty track, a bitter smoke she couldn't wave away. Her father, Thomas Vale, had been a quiet man, a man who spoke more to the seasons than to people, and he had died just as quietly, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than any noise. He'd also left behind the claim, a piece of earth he'd loved with a fierce, unspoken passion, and the loan he'd taken against it, a weight she now had to carry alone. What happened next wasn't a miracle, but something quieter, something sewn into the very fabric of her loss. The truth was waiting, not in a bank vault or a lawyer's letter, but in the lining of an old winter coat, a secret stitched with faded thread. Settle in, and let us know in the comments where you're watching from, as we follow a trail of memory and ink into the heart of a stolen valley. Margaret spent the next day in a fog of grim purpose, sorting through the few possessions her father had deemed worthy of keeping. His tools, worn to the shape of his hands. A small collection of books with cracked spines. A tin box holding her mother's locket. And in the corner, draped over a wooden chair, was his winter coat. It was a poor thing, made of heavy wool the color of dust, its elbows patched with leather and its collar frayed. It smelled of pine smoke, horse, and the cold, clean air of the high country. It was the last thing he had worn. She ran her hand over the rough fabric, a gesture of farewell, and felt the familiar ache in her chest. She had nothing. Less than nothing. The bank would take the land, the cabin, everything. She would be just another soul cast adrift in the vast, indifferent territory. Her fingers brushed against a stiff, awkward seam inside the lining, just below the collar. It was clumsy work, not her mother's neat, invisible stitches. It was her father's hand, she knew it instantly. A repair made in haste. Driven by a flicker of curiosity, a need to touch something he had touched, she found her mother's sewing kit. With a small, sharp blade, she carefully unpicked the thick, uneven threads. They came away slowly, reluctantly, as if guarding their secret. Beneath the wool, not a patch, but a small, flat packet wrapped in oiled canvas. Her fingers, numb with cold and apprehension, fumbled with the knot. Inside was a piece of parchment, folded into a tight square. It was brittle with age, and when she unfolded it, it crackled in protest. It was a map, or more precisely, half of one. The ink was faded to a soft brown, the lines drawn with a steady, deliberate hand. It showed the curve of a river she didn't recognize, the sharp angles of foothills, and a peculiar symbol, a circle with a cross inside it, drawn next to a formation of rocks labeled only the Sisters. There were no names, no directions, just the stark, silent language of the land. It was her father's drafting style, the same precise lettering she'd seen on his sketches of the cabin. But it made no sense. It was a fragment, a piece of a larger puzzle leading from nowhere to nothing. She held it up to the lantern light, her breath misting in the cold air. A fool's map, a child's drawing. It was worthless, just another piece of a life that had ended in failure. Another scrap of forgotten hope. She nearly crumpled it, nearly tossed it into the cold hearth to burn with the kindling. It was a reminder of all he had lost, of the dreams that had turned to dust in his hands. But something stayed her. A memory, thin as a ghost, of her father sitting at this very table, his head bent over a piece of parchment, a look of intense, quiet concentration on his face. He'd looked up and seen her watching, and a rare, sad smile had touched his lips before he'd quickly folded the paper away. He had been hiding it. He had sewn it into the coat he wore every day, keeping it close to his heart. It wasn't worthless to him, and so it couldn't be worthless to her. She folded the map carefully, the paper whispering against her fingers, and tucked it into the pocket of her dress. It was a sliver of a chance, a thread in a storm. It was all she had left. What was this map her father guarded so closely? Was it a path to a hidden treasure, or a map of a broken promise? Let us know in the comments what you think she should do, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of forgotten history. For Margaret Vale, the answer lay somewhere in the cold blue shadows of the foothills, and she was about to walk right into them. The next morning, Margaret rode into the small, dusty settlement of Providence. The town was little more than a single street flanked by false-fronted buildings, a place where whispers traveled faster than a horse's gallop. Her father's old mare, Juniper, a steady, graying animal with wise eyes, moved with a familiar, placid gait. Her presence a small comfort in a world that felt increasingly hostile. Margaret's destination was the Mercantile, a place that served as the town's post office, supply depot, and hub of all gossip. The man behind the counter was Silas Croft, a portly man with a watch chain stretched tight across his vest and eyes that missed nothing. He was also the local agent for the very bank that held the note on her father's claim. He greeted her with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Miss Vale," he said, his voice smooth and practiced. "Come for supplies?" "Information," Margaret replied, her own voice quiet but firm. She unfolded the map fragment on the worn wooden counter. The chatter in the store died down as a few onlookers drifted closer. Croft picked up the parchment, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were something distasteful. He squinted at it, then let out a short, dismissive laugh. "What's this, then? One of your father's little fantasies?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the entire store to hear. "A map to a gold mine that doesn't exist?" Thomas was always chasing shadows. The men leaning against the Cracker Barrel chuckled. Margaret's face burned, but she held her ground. "Do you recognize the landmarks?" Croft tossed the map back onto the counter. "It's nothing. A doodle. The sisters could be any of a dozen rock piles in those hills. You'd be wasting your time, girl. Better to spend it packing your things. The bank is patient, but not sentimental." His words were a clear threat, a public dismissal. He was branding her a fool, just as he had branded her father. As she turned to leave, her face set like stone. A hand gently touched her arm. It belonged to an old Shoshone woman who sometimes came to town to trade. Her face was a beautiful map of its own, etched with the lines of a long life. She was known only as Numa. Her dark eyes gazed not at Margaret, but at the parchment in her hand. "Some lines show where to go," the old woman said, her voice soft as dry leaves skittering on the wind. "Some show who to be." Then she turned and walked away, leaving Margaret standing in a pool of sudden silence. The cryptic words settled in Margaret's mind, meaningless and yet heavy with significance. She didn't understand, but she felt the weight of a choice. Croft's mockery had been meant to break her, to make her accept her fate. Instead, it had ignited a spark of her father's stubbornness. She would not be dismissed. She would not let his memory be a joke in this town. She walked out of the mercantile, the half-map clutched in her hand, the laughter of the men still ringing in her ears. She would follow this trail of ink and memory, not for gold, but for an answer. She owed her father that much. That afternoon, she packed a small canvas roll with what little she had, a tin of coffee, a side of bacon, a handful of hard biscuits, and her father's bedroll. She saddled Juniper, whose soft nuzzle against her shoulder felt like a vote of confidence. The decision was made. The world saw a worthless piece of paper. Numa saw a path of character. Margaret only knew it was the one road left for her to take. The journey began under a vast, empty sky the color of faded denim. Margaret rode east, away from the familiar dirt track to Providence, and into the rolling, sage-dusted foothills that climbed toward the distant, jagged peaks of the Wind River Range. The air grew thinner, cleaner. The silence was profound, broken only by the rhythmic creak of saddle leather and the steady plod of Juniper's hooves. The land was beautiful and brutal, a place that made a person feel small and temporary. For 2 days, she followed the faint lines of a game trail, her eyes scanning the horizon, comparing the shapes of the ridges and outcrops to the brown ink on the parchment. It was a frustrating, almost hopeless task. The map was an abstraction, the land an overwhelming reality of stone, scrub, and sky. Doubt, cold and sharp, began to creep in. Croft's mocking voice echoed in her mind. Chasing shadows. Was he right? Was she honoring her father? Or simply repeating his mistakes, following a phantom promise into the wilderness? She made camp the second evening in the shelter of a small bluff, the wind whispering through the tall pines. Juniper stood nearby, her head low, occasionally flicking an ear toward the deepening darkness. The horse was her only anchor, a living link to the man who had raised them both. Margaret built a small fire, the flames pushing back the immense loneliness of the landscape. She stared into the embers, the map spread on her knee. She remembered her father's hands, calloused and stained with dirt, yet so gentle when he'd tended to a sick animal or shown her how to read the stars. He wasn't a fool. He was a dreamer, perhaps, but not a fool. There was a logic to him, a quiet sense of order. The map had to have that same logic. The third day dawned cold and clear. Margaret pushed onward, a quiet determination having settled over her during the night. Around noon, she rounded a bend in a dry wash and saw it. 2 towering spires of granite, weathered by millennia of wind and ice, stood side by side against the sky. They were unmistakable. The sisters. A jolt went through her, a mixture of triumph and terror. The map was real. She dismounted, her legs unsteady, and walked toward the rock formation, Juniper following at a respectful distance. Up close, the rocks were immense, their surfaces a tapestry of lichen and shadow. The map showed the symbol, the circle with a cross, on the eastern face of the southern spire. She walked around it, her hand trailing against the cool, rough stone. There was nothing. No carving, no marking, just natural rock. The hope that had flared within her moments before guttered and died, leaving a cold ash of disappointment. It was a coincidence. Just 2 rocks that happened to look like the ones on a dead man's drawing. She sank to the ground, the full weight of her hopeless situation crashing down on her. The sun was beginning to dip toward the horizon, casting long, dramatic shadows across the valley floor. It was over. She had failed. She would sleep here tonight and turn back in the morning, back to face the banker and the end of her world. As the last rays of sunlight bled across the landscape, Margaret sat with her back against the cold granite, watching the world turn to shades of purple and gray. The air grew sharp with the coming night. She was too tired, too defeated, to even build a fire. She pulled her father's coat tighter around her shoulders, seeking a comfort that wasn't there. Juniper shifted her weight nearby, a soft, sighing sound in the immense quiet. The mare's presence was a silent rebuke to her despair. The horse was patient, enduring. It was a quality her father had admired, and one Margaret felt she sorely lacked. She was about to close her eyes, to give in to the exhaustion, when a glint of light caught her eye. It wasn't the warm, golden light of the setting sun, but a sharper, more focused reflection, coming from the very rock face she had just inspected. She stood up, her curiosity stirring faintly through the fog of her disappointment. She walked back to the eastern face of the southern spire, her eyes tracing the path of the final sunbeam as it sliced through a notch in the opposite ridge. The beam landed on a small, almost flat section of the rock, illuminating what had been invisible in the full light of day. There, so faint it was little more than a scratch, was the symbol from the map. A circle with a cross inside it. It wasn't carved deeply into the rock, but etched with a fine, precise tool, designed to be seen only at this exact time of day, perhaps on a certain day of the year. Her breath caught in her throat. This was no coincidence. It was intentional, a secret meant only for someone who knew how and when to look. A surveyor's mark. Her father had been a surveyor's assistant in his youth, before he'd staked his claim. He knew the trade. He knew how to read the land, not just for its surface features, but for its hidden lines, its secret geometry. A flood of memories returned. Her father teaching her how to use a compass, how to measure distance by her own stride, how to understand the subtle shifts in terrain. He wasn't mapping a treasure. He was mapping the land itself. The lines on the parchment weren't just drawings of a river and some hills. They were bearings, sight lines. The map wasn't a picture. It was a set of instructions. A profound shift occurred within her. She was no longer a grieving daughter chasing a ghost. She was an apprentice picking up her master's tools. The disappointment washed away, replaced by a surge of fierce, focused energy. She took out the map, her hands no longer trembling. The next line on the fragment pointed northwest from the sisters, toward a low saddle between two hills. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that if she walked that line, she would find another mark. The night was no longer a threat, but a pause, a time to rest before the real work began. The secret of the valley wasn't buried in the ground, it was written on it. And her father had left her the key to read it. The next morning, Margaret began her work in earnest. She used her father's old compass, its brass casing warm in her palm, and sighted a line northwest from the marker on the sisters. She measured her paces as he had taught her, her stride even and consistent, her mind focused on the count. The land was rough, the terrain broken by ravines and thickets of thorny brush. It was slow, grueling labor. Juniper followed patiently, her bridle jingling softly, a four-legged shadow to Margaret's solitary progress. By midday, she found the second marker, another faint etching on a flat stone at the base of a gnarled juniper tree, exactly where the line on the map indicated it should be. The discovery sent a thrill of vindication through her. She was on the right path. For days, this became her rhythm. Rise at dawn, sight the next bearing, and walk the line. The work was physically demanding, but her mind was clear and sharp. With each marker she found, she felt a deeper connection to her father. as if she were walking in his very footsteps, seeing the land through his eyes. She was learning the grammar of his secret language. He had used the setting sun, the notches in the ridges, the very bones of the earth as his monuments. It was a survey of incredible precision and subtle artistry, hidden in plain sight. One afternoon, while tracking a line across a wide, grassy basin, she saw a rider approaching. He was tall in the saddle, his figure lean and straight. As he drew closer, she saw he was a rancher, his face weathered by the sun and wind, his eyes a pale, watchful blue. He rode a strong-looking buckskin and led a pack horse. He stopped a respectful distance away, not wanting to spook Juniper. "You're a long way from any place, ma'am," he said. His voice was low and carried a note of caution. "This is private range." "I'm just passing through," Margaret said, her hand resting on Juniper's neck. "You're not passing. You're walking a line," he observed, his gaze sharp. "I've been watching you for 2 days. You walk like a surveyor." Margaret felt a prickle of alarm. "Who are you?" "William Mercer," he replied. "This is my family's land, or what's left of it." He dismounted, his movements economical and sure. He was guarded, but not hostile. "My father was a surveyor," Margaret offered, deciding a piece of the truth was better than a lie. "I'm following one of his old routes." She showed him the map fragment. William studied it for a long moment, his expression unreadable. He traced the lines with his finger, his brow furrowed in concentration. "I've seen these marks before," he said quietly, looking up at her. "Years ago. My father called them the ghost lines. He said they were from the original territorial survey, before the big ranchers and the railroad came through." He pointed to a symbol on her map. "That's an old Army Corps of Engineers mark. I was a scout for a time. I know their work." He looked from the map to her face, a new understanding in his eyes. "This isn't just an old route, is it? This is a boundary line." Margaret nodded, her heart pounding. He understood. He saw what she saw. "I think so," she said. "But my map is incomplete." "Maybe I can help," William said. "The next point on that bearing should be near a spring at the base of that butte. My father showed it to me once." He looked at her, a silent question in his eyes. He was a stranger, but he was the first person who hadn't laughed at her, who hadn't dismissed her quest. She saw in his face the same quiet stubbornness she felt in herself, the same deep connection to the land. She made her decision. "All right, Mr. Mercer," she said. "Show me." Together they rode toward the butte. William moved through the landscape with a quiet confidence that spoke of long familiarity. He pointed out landmarks, not by their official names, but by the names his family had given them over generations. He spoke of his father, who had lost most of his original homestead in a series of legal disputes with powerful cattle barons, men who had arrived with lawyers and documents that superseded his family's older claims. The bank that held Margaret's note was a silent partner in many of those outfits. As he spoke, the pieces began to click into place in Margaret's mind. This wasn't just about her father's secret. It was about something much larger. They found the spring just as William had predicted, a trickle of clear, cold water emerging from a fissure in the rock. And there, on a stone half buried in the damp earth, was the next marker. From there, the trail led them higher into a grove of ancient, wind-twisted pines. The final mark on Margaret's fragment pointed to a spot in the center of the grove. There was no rock, no tree, just a patch of earth that seemed slightly sunken. "This is it," Margaret said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is the last point I have." William dismounted and began to probe the ground with the heel of his boot. "Feels hollow here," he muttered. He pulled a small spade from his pack horse and began to dig. The earth was soft and loamy. A few inches down, the spade hit something solid: wood. Working together, they cleared the dirt away, revealing the weathered gray planks of a small, collapsed roof. It was a line cabin, or what was left of one, a shelter for shepherds or trappers, long since abandoned and reclaimed by the earth. It had been deliberately buried. "Why would he lead me here?" Margaret wondered aloud. "He wasn't leading you to the cabin," William said, his eyes scanning the ruin. "He was leading you to what's inside it." Using the spade as a lever, they pried away the rotten timbers of the roof, revealing a small, dark space beneath. The air that rose from it was stale and smelled of dust and decay. Margaret lowered herself into the shallow pit. The floor was packed earth, save for one corner, where a single wide floorboard lay slightly askew. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She knelt and worked her fingers into the gap, pulling it up. Beneath it, nestled in the dry dirt, was a rectangular object wrapped in oilcloth. It was heavy, solid. William reached down and lifted it out into the sunlight. He carefully unwrapped the layers of stiff, cracking material. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, the kind used by surveyors and engineers. Its cover was stamped with the seal of the U.S. Territorial Survey. Tied to it with a piece of twine was another folded piece of parchment. Margaret took it with trembling hands. She unfolded it. It was the other half of the map. When she placed the two pieces together, they formed a complete whole, a perfect survey of the entire valley, from the river to the high peaks. And inside the ledger, on the first page, was her father's elegant script. "The true and original boundary survey of the Sweetwater Valley," it read. "Thomas Vale, Assistant Surveyor. Witnessed by Elias Mercer." William stared at the second name. Elias Mercer was my grandfather. They opened the book. The pages were filled with her father's meticulous notes, with dates, coordinates, and detailed sketches of the landscape. It was a complete record of the valley's original survey, conducted 20 years earlier, before the land rush, before the powerful interests arrived. But tucked into the back of the ledger was a series of letters, written in her father's hand to his partner, a man named Franklin Henderson. The letters spoke of their shared work, of their duty to draw honest lines. Then the tone changed. The later letters were desperate, pleading. Her father accused Henderson of colluding with land speculators, of creating a second, fraudulent set of maps and deeds. He wrote of threats made against his family, of being forced off his own claim and into silence. The final entry was dated just a year before his death. "Henderson has sold his soul," he wrote. "He has taken my map, the other half of our work, and used it to legitimize the theft. They have stolen this entire valley. I am hiding my record, my half of the truth. I pray one day someone finds it and can make the lines straight again." It was all there. The proof. Silas Croft's employers, the cattle barons, the bank, their legal titles were built on a foundation of forgery and betrayal. William's family hadn't just lost their land in a legal dispute. They had been systematically robbed, along with dozens of others. Margaret finally understood. Her father hadn't been chasing a shadow. He had been guarding a truth so dangerous it had cost him everything. He wasn't mapping a treasure of gold. He was mapping a legacy of justice, a promise to the land and its rightful people. He had sewn one half into his coat and buried the other, creating a puzzle only someone who knew his mind and his methods could ever hope to solve. The weight of the discovery settled on them both. It was a truth that could restore a community, but it was also a truth that powerful men would do anything to keep buried. As if on cue, the sky, which had been clear and blue, began to darken with an unnatural speed. A low moan of wind swept through the pines. A storm was coming, a fierce, early blizzard blowing down from the high peaks. They were exposed, isolated, and holding a book that could get them killed. The shelter of the ruined cabin was not enough. They needed to find better cover, and fast. The first snowflakes, hard and stinging, began to fall as they scrambled to pack their horses. The wind rose to a howl, and the world dissolved into a blinding chaos of white. They were trapped. The blizzard descended with a terrifying fury, wiping out the world in a swirling vortex of snow and wind. Visibility dropped to near zero. William, relying on instinct and a scout's knowledge of the terrain, led them down from the high grove toward a rocky overhang he knew of, a shallow cave that offered some protection from the storm's onslaught. They huddled in the back of the small shelter, the horses standing close for warmth, their coats already white with snow. The ledger, wrapped again in its oilcloth, was tucked safely in Margaret's saddlebag. The cold was a physical thing, a crushing weight that seeped into their bones. They shared the last of Margaret's coffee, sipping the hot, bitter liquid from a single tin cup, their hands shaking. The storm was their immediate crisis, a battle for survival against the elements. But as the hours passed, another threat emerged. Through a brief lull in the wind, they heard the faint sound of voices, men shouting to one another. 2 riders appeared out of the white gloom, their figures hunched against the wind. They were Croft's men, sent from Providence to find her, to stop her. They hadn't seen the small cave yet, but they were close, their search pattern bringing them directly toward the overhang. William drew his pistol, his face grim. But before he could act, another sound cut through the storm's howl, a child's cry. Out of the blizzard stumbled a man and a woman, pulling a small handcart that held 2 young children, their faces blue with cold. They were settlers, a family whose wagon had broken down, caught in the storm while trying to cross the pass. The man, whose name was David, looked at Margaret and William with desperate eyes. "Please," he begged, "our children. They won't last much longer out here." At that moment, Croft's men spotted them. They drew their rifles, their intentions clear. The choice was instant and absolute. This was the test. It was no longer just about a book or a piece of land. Margaret looked at the terrified family, then at the ledger in her bag. She met William's gaze, and he saw the same resolve in her eyes that he felt in his own heart. He gave a sharp nod. They were no longer just 2 individuals. They were protectors. While William positioned himself at the mouth of the cave, laying down suppressing fire that sent Croft's men scrambling for cover, Margaret helped the family into the small shelter. She wrapped the children in her own bedroll, rubbing their frozen hands and feet. She gave the mother, Sarah, the last of their food. She acted with a calm, steady competence that surprised even herself. She was her father's daughter, a person who did what needed to be done. The standoff lasted for hours. The storm was their unlikely ally, its ferocity making a direct assault on the cave impossible. Croft's men were pinned down, unable to risk a charge in the deep, drifting snow. Eventually, as darkness fell and the blizzard reached its peak, they gave up, their shouted curses swallowed by the wind. They retreated, vowing to return. Inside the cave, the small group huddled together, sharing body heat against the brutal cold. David and Sarah, their children now sleeping fitfully, looked at Margaret with a gratitude that needed no words. She had chosen to shelter them, to risk everything for strangers. In that small, frozen cave, in the heart of a deadly storm, a new kind of community was forged, bound not by law or land, but by a shared act of courage and compassion. The blizzard had been a trial by fire, or rather, by ice. And Margaret Vale had not been found wanting. When the storm finally broke 2 days later, the world was transformed, buried under a thick blanket of pristine white snow. The air was achingly cold and bright. Croft's men were long gone. After making sure the settler family was safe and had a fire going, Margaret and William saddled their horses. The ledger felt heavier than ever, not with its physical weight, but with the weight of responsibility. They rode back to Providence, the journey slow and difficult through the deep snow. When they arrived, the town was stirring, digging itself out. Their entrance did not go unnoticed. The sight of Margaret Vale, whom Silas Croft had loudly declared lost to the storm, riding in alongside the quiet and respected William Mercer, sent a ripple of murmurs through the street. They went directly to the Territorial Land Office, a small, cramped room smelling of paper and stove smoke. The clerk was a young man from the East named Elias Thorne, known for his fastidious nature and his unwavering adherence to the rules. He was the kind professional, the man who dealt not in rumor but in fact. Silas Croft was already there, loudly recounting his concern for Miss Vale's safety. When he saw her, his face paled. Margaret ignored him. She placed the leather-bound ledger on the counter in front of Thorne. "I believe this is the original survey of the Sweetwater Valley," she said, her voice clear and steady. Thorne opened the book, his brow furrowed in skepticism. He began to read. William stood beside Margaret, his presence a silent statement of support. A crowd began to gather at the door, drawn by the unfolding drama. The family Margaret and William had rescued, the Davids, had made it to town, and their story had already spread. The story of the 2 riders who had appeared in the blizzard, of the woman who had given her own blanket to save their children. Thorne spent nearly an hour poring over the ledger, comparing its entries to the official plat maps hanging on the wall. The silence in the room was absolute. He traced the lines with his finger. He checked the dates. He examined the seal. Finally, he looked up, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and professional excitement. "The discrepancies are undeniable," he announced to the quiet room. "The official deeds on file are based on forged survey points. This book, this is the true record. It's all here. The original boundaries, the witness signatures." He looked at Margaret with a newfound respect. "Where did you find this?" "My father left it for me," she said simply. At that moment, the townspeople in the doorway began to murmur. Old grievances, long-buried stories of lost claims and unfair deals surfaced. Many of them were the children and grandchildren of the homesteaders who had been cheated. The town's chorus of mockery had transformed into a chorus of reverence. They looked at Margaret not as a fool chasing shadows, but as the keeper of a sacred trust. Silas Croft stood frozen, his face ashen. He wasn't threatened with violence or arrested. He was simply rendered irrelevant, his power dissolved by the quiet authority of a truth written in faded ink. The vindication was not loud or explosive. It was a deep, quiet shifting of the foundations of the entire valley. The lines were finally being made straight. In the weeks that followed, the valley was quietly remade. Lawyers and judges descended on Providence, and with the irrefutable evidence of Thomas Vale's ledger, the fraudulent deeds were systematically overturned. The land was being restored to the families of its original homesteaders, including the full measure of the Mercer Ranch. The balance of power had shifted, not through force, but through the patient, stubborn courage of one woman. Margaret's own claim was secured, the bank's foreclosure notice withdrawn and replaced with a letter of apology. The land was hers, free and clear, just as her father had always intended. One evening, as the sun set, casting a warm, golden light across the valley, Margaret stood on the small porch of her cabin. The air was cool and smelled of pine and damp earth. She had spent the day mending the very fence her father had built, her hands now calloused like his had been. William Mercer rode up, dismounting by the porch steps. He didn't come as a stranger anymore, but as a friend, a partner in the quiet revolution they had started. He handed her a small, freshly baked loaf of bread from his family's kitchen. They stood together in comfortable silence for a moment, watching the last light paint the distant peaks in hues of rose and violet. The world felt peaceful, settled. "The Davids are staying," William said. "They're taking up a claim down by the river, the one that was stolen from your father's friend." "Good," Margaret murmured. "This valley needs more families like them." "It needs more people like you," William corrected her gently. He looked out at the vast expanse of land, now breathing with a new sense of justice. "All this time," he said, his voice filled with a quiet wonder, "we thought your father was a failed prospector. We thought he was looking for gold." Margaret smiled, a slow, sad smile of deep understanding. She thought of the faded ink, the hidden markers, the coat that had held the key. She finally understood the full measure of the man he was and the legacy he had left her. It wasn't about wealth, or land, or even revenge. It was about the integrity of a line drawn in the dirt, the sanctity of a promise made between a man and the earth he worked. She looked at the horizon, at the land that was now truly hers, and gave voice to the story's moral, the quiet apotheosis of her long journey. "He wasn't mapping a treasure," she said. "He was mapping a promise. We want to thank you for joining us for this story to the very end. It's a reminder that sometimes the greatest inheritances aren't things we can hold, but truths we can live by." If you were moved by Margaret's journey, please consider liking this video and subscribing to our channel for more stories of the Forgotten West. We'll see you next time.